I found 15 British war dramas from the 1960s that almost nobody talks about today. Some are tense thrillers with real B-17 bombers. Some are comedies, some banned in their own countries, and one even changed safety rules for movies. How many of these have you actually heard of? Let's see which of these lost war movies is worth watching. The War Lover is all about men who only come alive in war. Steve McQueen leads as Captain Buzz Rickson, an American B-17 pilot stationed in England during World War II. Buzz, at his core, just cannot exist outside the adrenaline of combat. The film shows him always picking the riskiest bombing runs, always gunning for more action, never satisfied unless he pushes right up to the edge. His co-pilot, Ed Bolin, played by Robert Wagner, is the opposite. Steady, responsible, and he's watching Buzz spiral as he keeps tempting fate both in the air and on the ground. Over time, Buzz's risk-taking ramps up. He ignores orders, he strafes fields just for the thrill, and Ed is left to decide how far he can go backing a man who's clearly losing control. It all leads to a final mission where Buzz's obsession with glory finally puts the entire crew at risk, and Ed faces a real test of conscience. The flying scenes look fantastic. 3 actual B-17 bombers restored and flown for the movie. They filmed it at a Royal Air Force base in England, so you get real dogfights and bombing runs. The drama on the ground feels a bit familiar, but it's a solid war movie with McQueen in a role that's darker than a lot of his usual stuff. Maybe that's why it sort of vanished. Invasion Quartet doesn't try to take itself too seriously. It's a British war comedy with a premise straight out of a cartoon. You have 4 wounded Allied soldiers stuck in a military hospital, bored out of their minds. When they hear about a giant German cannon shelling the English coast from across the channel, they decide they're done sitting around. So they escape, steal a boat, and head off to France to blow the thing up themselves. It all turns into a slapstick mission behind enemy lines. They fumble around in stolen German uniforms, stumble across the cannon, and somehow end up taking it out. Mostly by luck, definitely not by skill. The whole thing riffs on the guns of Navarone, but goes for gags instead of suspense. The script jumps from one comic set piece to the next, more like a collection of sketches than a tight movie. It did all right in the UK, but faded everywhere else. If there's one thing to remember, it's that John Briley, who went on to win an Oscar for writing Gandhi, helped co-write this early in his career. Not exactly a line you expect to hear in an Academy Award acceptance speech, but that's film history for you. A remote army outpost in a newly independent African nation is about to become a powder keg. Richard Attenborough plays Regimental Sergeant Major Lauderdale, a by-the-book officer clinging to old colonial discipline while rebel troops close in on the base. The film turns into a siege story as Lauderdale tries to keep his men and a handful of civilians safe. He's holding out in the barracks while negotiating with African officers whose allegiances shift by the hour. Attenborough brings real weight to Lauderdale, rigid, stubborn, the living face of the old empire, even as the ground shifts beneath him. There's a young Mia Farrow here too. It's her first big film. Some things do date the film, especially the romantic subplot and the whole imperial nostalgia angle, but what stands out is how tight the thriller elements play. Attenborough wins the BAFTA for Best Actor, and The Siege is up there with the best British war film tension, right alongside Zulu. If you can set aside the dated politics, you get a really solid, nerve-wracking thriller. The Bofors Gun takes the war out of the trenches and drops it onto a West German base in 1954, right at the tail end of Britain's National Service era. A group of British soldiers stand guard over an old anti-aircraft gun. It's an adaptation of John McGrath's play, and you can definitely feel the stage roots here. There's small cast, all character. The story focuses on Lance Bombardier Terry Evans, a quiet, untested leader trying to keep his crew in line. But one of his men, the volatile Irish gunner O'Rourke, refuses to play along. What starts as minor insubordination spirals through the night becomes a psychological contest that pulls in the entire group. By dawn, everything explodes, literally and figuratively. The movie works with a tiny budget, so there's no big battle scenes, just tension and slow-burn power struggles. Some find the film's bleakness a bit much, but the acting is top tier, especially both leads. It's an honest look at authority and breakdown, with no sentimentality. Jack Gold makes his feature debut here, later going on to direct the excellent Aces High. Here he gives you a tight, claustrophobic portrait of Army life and the rules that bind. Released in the States as Jungle Fighters, this one drops a British patrol into the Malayan jungle in 1942. 7 soldiers, all different backgrounds and attitudes, get stranded behind Japanese lines and hole up in an abandoned hut. They capture a lone Japanese scout, and that sets off a moral showdown. A sergeant insists on dragging the prisoner along, but a private starts to see the Japanese soldier as a person, not just an enemy. A corporal, played by Richard Harris, wants nothing to do with compassion. He'd rather shoot first and not ask questions. The movie quickly turns into a debate about what's right and what's necessary. Radios fail, the enemy closes in. The tension here just builds and builds. The movie is based on a play, and sometimes that comes through. Lots of dialogue, a bit stagey, but it lets the characters develop. The tension doesn't come from action set pieces, but from the ways these men break down, betray, or try to hang on to some idea of right and wrong. The film doesn't shy away from uncomfortable themes, even after toning down the harsher language of the play. The character work is what lifts it up. By the time the action comes, it hits harder because you know exactly who each of these men really are. This one's based on a true story. The Password is Courage tells the story of Sergeant Major Charles Coward, a real British prisoner of war. He was known for pulling off a string of escapes and just constantly making trouble for the Germans. Dirk Bogarde plays Coward, and he said later that this movie was a welcome change after his darker roles. The film keeps things pretty light. You meet Coward in a Nazi camp. He refuses to give in, starts pulling escapes, impersonates a wounded German, even gets an Iron Cross by accident before someone figures out who he really is. Back in camp, he's always the one staging distractions, organizing trades, plotting the next breakout. The password in the title is part of an escape plan, passing the word along before a mass breakout. There's a highlight set piece. Coward and the other prisoners blow up an ammunition train by tossing flaming bundles onto it. The director actually derailed real train cars for this scene. Critics back then didn't love it. They thought it was too lighthearted, almost Boy Scout charade territory, especially considering the real Coward's story is darker. He actually smuggled Jews out of Auschwitz, and some of that just gets brushed over or dropped in suddenly in the movie. Still, as a war adventure, it sits in the same lane as The Great Escape, just with more jokes and less tension. The Valiant is one of those films that rarely comes up, even among war movie fans. It's a British-Italian co-production set in World War II, and it's built around a single naval incident. You get 2 Italian Navy frogmen sneaking into a British harbor to attach mines to a Royal Navy battleship. This pulls from real-life Italian commando raids, guys operating mini-subs, getting right up under enemy ships. They pull off the sabotage, but they're captured by the British. The rest of the film runs on a countdown. The mines are set to blow, and now these 2 Italian prisoners are stuck. Do they tell the British what's coming or stay quiet and let the explosion go off? The film shifts back and forth between the British officers trying to find the explosives and the Italians wrestling with what to do. It's not a big action film. Most of the drama happens in cramped rooms, the ship's brig, a couple offices. The tension is there though, and what makes it stand out is the point of view. You actually see the Italians as resourceful, even heroic, and the British as respectful opponents. The plot comes from real attacks at Alexandria and Gibraltar, and the underwater scenes have some realism because the filmmakers brought in an ex-Italian Navy officer as an advisor. This one's notorious for a lot of reasons. First off, it's nothing like the old Errol Flynn version. This 1968 film is dark, satirical, and takes a hard look at one of the most infamous disasters in British military history, the charge at Balaclava during the Crimean War. The higher-ups here are arrogant or clueless, and their mistakes and petty rivalries are what send the cavalry straight into Russian cannons. The script makes that painfully clear. What really sets this film apart is the style. It jumps between live action and animated Victorian-style cartoons. These interludes mock the British press, the officer class, the whole idea of military glory. It's a war epic and a takedown of the entire system at the same time. The film bombed in the U.S., partly because American audiences wanted a heroic adventure, not a cynical satire, and partly because it just spends too much time on a limp romantic subplot. But if you want to see a film that is honest about military stupidity, this is the one. This one's set during the Malayan Emergency, a guerrilla war in British colonial Malaya. William Holden plays Ferris, an American who stayed behind after the Japanese occupation and became a rubber planter. His two closest friends from the war are now on opposite sides. One has become a communist rebel leader, and Ferris tries to avoid picking sides but gets dragged in. It's part adventure, part romance, part political drama. The main character is an American who backs the British, but the film actually does take time to show the communist point of view, at least more than you'd expect from a Western production at that time. The director, Lewis Gilbert, later did big Bond films, so there's some solid spectacle here. The Malaysian government initially helped with military gear and extras. That changed fast once they saw the script. They objected to the positive light cast on the communist rebel and the way colonial Britain was portrayed. The film was banned in Malaysia right after it was finished. The emergency is still a touchy subject over there, and back in 1964, the authorities said the Seventh Dawn might give the wrong idea about the conflict. So locals never saw it in theaters. This one is a small-scale British-American war film inspired by the Royal Navy's real midget submarine attacks on the German battleship. James Caan, before he was a big star, plays a Canadian officer leading the mission. He's tasked with getting these tiny experimental subs into a fjord to blow up a German warship. You get your standard mission movie setup, training, planning, tension, the final push, and it's all done with a budget that doesn't allow for big effects, but the film makes it work. The best moments are the claustrophobic scenes inside the subs, plus some solid suspense during the depth charge sequences. It never got much attention, probably because it didn't have the spectacle or scale of bigger war films. But for people who care about the nuts and bolts of naval history, it's one of the few movies that even tries to show what these operations were really like. Tunes of Glory stands out as a drama that never touches a battlefield. Instead, it looks at the peacetime British Army right after World War II, specifically a Highland regiment stuck between old-school tradition and post-war reality. The whole film is a power struggle. Alec Guinness plays Major Jock Sinclair, the rough-edged acting commander, a man who fights his way up from the ranks. The soldiers love him, but he rubs plenty of people the wrong way. Suddenly, John Mills enters as Lieutenant Colonel Basil Barrow. He's everything Sinclair isn't. Upper class, rigid, rule-bound, and marked by time as a war prisoner in a Japanese camp. And now Barrow has command, but Sinclair can't stand it. The movie doesn't just show arguments, it digs in deep. Every scene pulls at discipline, pride, trauma, and respect. You see Guinness disappear into this swaggering, red-haired brute while Mills quietly falls apart under pressure. The result is a character study with real bite. Tunes of Glory picked up an Oscar nomination for its screenplay. James Kennaway adapted his own novel, but even with all that, the movie kind of slipped through the cracks. It deserves a lot more attention than it gets. Counterpoint gives you a strange mashup. War drama meets classical music. It's set during the Battle of the Bulge, with Charlton Heston as orchestra conductor Lionel Evans. German forces capture him and his orchestra while they're touring Belgium for the USO. Instead of prison, they end up in a grand castle. Maximilian Schell plays Colonel Arndt, a Nazi officer obsessed with classical music. He wants a private concert. That's the price for staying alive. So Evans figures out how to stall and play for time. He uses Arndt's love of music, hoping Allied troops show up before the Nazis lose patience. The film becomes a psychological face-off, conductor versus colonel. Meanwhile, the musicians rehearse under guard. Some plot escape. A young cellist tries to soften a guard's heart. The tension peaks with a concert in the castle's Great Hall, Allied bombardment closing in. The premise works, even if the pacing drags in spots. Heston commands every scene. Shell gives Arndt unexpected depth, and you get this duel of control at the core. Just don't expect much action. There's way more music than gunfire here. Play Dirty marks Andre de Toth's last credited film. Michael Caine stars as a British officer in North Africa, forced to lead a group of commandos behind enemy lines, disguised as Italians. The goal: blow up a German oil depot. It's gritty, it's mean, and it doesn't pretend otherwise. This film does not try to give you likable characters. They move, they shoot, they do the job, no questions, no hesitations. There's a moment when they fool a group of Arabs, then kill them without a second thought. De Toth directs with a cold efficiency, and you never know where things go next. You see a lot of people compare this to The Dirty Dozen, but honestly, Play Dirty runs its own race. Martin Scorsese calls it mean, not sadistic, but stripped of comfort, pragmatic to the bone. You see the nihilism and feel the 1969 mood, all shadows of Vietnam creeping in. Michael Caine at first feels a little out of place among the hardened killers, but that's part of what works. The displacement, the randomness, it all adds up. The Hill never plays out like a typical war movie. Instead, it's more of a prison camp thriller with a young Sean Connery, determined to break away from Bond. Connery plays Joe Roberts, thrown into a British military prison in the Sahara after he refuses a combat order. The place is a nightmare, ruled by a brutal Sergeant Major, Harry Andrews, who uses a giant man-made sandhill as punishment. Prisoners have to run it again and again, carrying heavy packs in the heat. Roberts ends up in a cell with other misfits. Some resent him, some respect him. As the camp grinds them down, Andrews' right-hand man, Staff Sergeant Williams, torments one prisoner to death. It sets off a battle of wills. The real war here is psychological. Authority versus rebellion, man against man. Ray Rigby, who wrote the script, spent time in military prison himself. You see that firsthand experience on the screen. The Hill didn't light up the box office, but critics respected it, and the screenplay won at Cannes. Woody Allen calls it one of the greatest American movies, even though it's British, and Connery called it a personal turning point. The Victors aims high, an ambitious World War II epic told as a series of vignettes. It follows American GIs from the invasion of Italy through to Berlin, but the focus never lands on battles. Instead, it explores the cost of war on the soul, what soldiers become when they lose track of right and wrong. Carl Foreman, blacklisted in Hollywood, writes and directs here. The whole thing unfolds in black and white with real newsreel footage mixed in, almost like a documentary, and it shows the reality of war in full. You see prostitution, black market deals, and a moment where bored American soldiers use a stray puppy for target practice. That scene, bleak as it gets, forces you to see just how war destroys empathy. The Victors premiered in 1963, with America on the edge of Vietnam and haunted by Korea. It landed right before Kennedy's assassination, which crushed any chance at commercial success. No one wanted to sit through 2.5 hours of moral agony right after the country fell into mourning. Still, for all its heavy-handedness, The Victor stands as an honest look at the darkness underneath the good war myth. Way ahead of its time and almost forgotten now.